Hello, everybody. My name is Tiia Sudenkaarne. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Helsinki. This presentation is about using theories and frameworks, specifically discussing gender and sexual variance and how they relate to justice. To me, bioethics is about considerations of the moral, societal, and political issues brought about by sickness, health, care, and environment. This includes asking what kind of ontological assumptions these concepts build on, what kind of knowledges they entail, and how should ethical issues around them be resolved. I come from a queer feminist orientation. I also have training in analytical philosophy, and that all is combined in what I'm about to present to you in this talk. Before I do that, however, I'd like to briefly tell you about the research environment that I've been based in during the recent years, which is the Center for the Social Study of Microbes at University of Helsinki. It's funded by Wellcome, but other different research projects, like the one that I'm currently with, funded by Kone Foundation, have their own separate funding. The CSSM is a hub for social scientists and artists to come together and try to think about the ways in which human microbial relations and microbes themselves, such as the ones used in ancient practices of fermentation or metabolism or soil, challenge the theories and methodology we have from this techno-scientific understanding and seek to build new bridges and new theories and methodologies living with microbes. So why do theories matter? A very simple yet profound answer is that theories are in fact situated knowledges. They are used to explain, predict, and describe the world, but they also make worlds. And when we look at specific issues around health from the viewpoint of those particularly involved through embodiment and personal involvement, we can often see that the frameworks that are dominantly used are not necessarily solving any of the ethical issues that those involved with these bioethical issues are facing. So what we mean by framework is a cohesion seeking theoretical approach and practical applications that also has ontological, political, and ethical aims. And these frameworks are equipped with methodologies. Based on my own work, I would like to briefly discuss antimicrobial resistance as an example of a health phenomena that is in need of new ethical frameworks. Now, according to a prominent definition by the World Health Organization, antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, occurs when bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites change over time and no longer respond to antimicrobials, making infections harder to treat and increasing the risk of disease spread, severe illness, and death. However, the dominant understanding of AMR often prioritizes human health and also very particular um, white affluent understanding of what health is. While certain uh, One Health approaches that refer to understanding connections and intertwinements between for example, human and animal health, have laudably criticized primacy of human health, there is a need for frameworks that can consider more than human animals, multi-species perspectives, ecosystems, and stratified human health in same bioethical frameworks. Um, when we look at um, health in this matter, it also becomes a justice issue. How to craft and support frameworks that would address these injustices, often excluded from work with dominant justice frameworks, how to navigate layers of vulnerabilities between people, and should there be one framework seeking to address as many structural injustices as possible, how to specifically safeguard against structural racism, for example, how to make the bioethical principle of justice, which I will talk more about later, engage with reproductive justice as defined by Black feminist thinking, how to make the leap from theory to activism if new rubrics for that are needed. And one suggestion would be to focus on solidarity under the crisis of justice. And we will have discussed this crisis and offered one of the solutions um, as the concept of more than human justice orientation. And a more than human justice orientation demands development of new moral theories, which we have argued are crucial for AMR in both theory and management. Such a perspective, attuned to both social justice and a more than human justice orientation, is crucial to show how seemingly unified positions within human networks, so similar more than human networks, have intersecting layered vulnerabilities that both make people and environments more vulnerable also. These vulnerabilities align with existing social justice issues within our race, ability and embodiment, and gender and sexuality. Further, such a framework should be able to address multi-species vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities cascade following social scientific patterns, but also take on new layers in AMR. For example, Macpherson and colleagues have identified specific antibiotic vulnerabilities and studied ways in which to reveal how antimicrobial provision in rural Malawi, for example, impacts care in conditions of extreme scarcity. In terms of conflicts of interest, I have a chapter in Routledge Handbook of Feminist Bioethics. It's on a queer feminist framework and it's central to my current work. But other than that, I have no conflicts of interests. To reiterate, theories matter because they are social constructions and guide not only scientific but also moral attention. To offer a timely example, as I'm recording this, there is strong impetus to remove all kinds of treatment for gender dysphoria from public healthcare system in the UK and in Finland, which is where I'm situated. So that is an expression of a paradigm shift in what used to be good practice and good care because of these theoretical, although also in highly politicized and non-scientific claims about the nature of gender and of sex in a sort of a allegedly biological originality. So these have direct effects to the care that people can receive and what type of care they can access through structures like public health. And theories matter because they both are embodied in the sense that they should deal with real life injustice, but also they become embodied. Their effects are felt by real life people with different layers of vulnerabilities. To offer another example, there is strong political impetus in several countries to allow conscientious objection for medical professionals based on patient's gender and or sexual identity, meaning that medical professionals could deny people basic healthcare based on, for example, their gender status, and in effect leave them without the basic, even life-saving treatment because of their convictions. There's obviously a hugely grave moral dilemma here. There is no explanatory bias in Western medical ethics. On the contrary, in fact, because universality is one of its virtues. Yet these type of gross injustices can happen within that same uh, moral framework. And this is one of the reasons why we need organizations like Black and Brown in bioethics too, to bring this forth, that what is supposed to be universal is not universal for all people. And what is crucial to look at in looking at this is to analyze what explains this discrepancy between theories and frameworks and the actual fulfillment of the principles or rules and guidelines for all people. So, what is the discrepancy between theory and practice? So, as already brushed upon and the examples have demonstrated, one of the big medical ethics discourses or frameworks is so-called principlism. This refers to often four principles-based model, those being respect for autonomy, justice, the principle to do good, and the principle to do no harm. Now, how these principles emerge is a tricky topic, and I'm going to go through it very briefly here. There's an explanation that says that principles are derived from common morality, meaning that is something very mundane and inherent and accessible to all people, seemingly in the same manner, or that indeed there is a common morality theory that explains how these principles become to be the way that they are. Now, for justice, this is particularly interesting because, as I will discuss later in a bit more detail, justice is obviously a hugely philosophically robust concept. Yet, we can easily see how, in a medical ethical context, the discussions that would be needed for all the stakeholders in question to be actually agreeing that this course of action or practice is in fact just would take a lot more ethical deliberation than is actually needed. Also, out of the four principles that I mentioned, oftentimes, even though some of the most prolific theorists of principalism do not say that there is a sort of a hierarchy between the principles, but very often the principle of respect for autonomy gets a lot more attention than, for example, justice, even though it could be easily argued that if there would be a hierarchy, justice could encompass and exceed many of the discussions that are taking place through autonomy in a sort of neoliberal rights-oriented framework, celebrating individuality in a way that we've used to understanding it. Um, and from a queer feminist bioethics viewpoint, several critiques against principlism have been made precisely from an embodied point of view, bringing forth specific gendered needs based on reproductive justice, for example, which means access to specific reproductive technologies or contraception or screenings, but also the notion of being allowed to have children, not to have children, and to parent the children one has in safe and sustainable environments. And some of the queer critiques are already covered with the example of conscientious objection. That how can it be that in a seemingly principlist common morality applying to everyone framework, there are people and bodies and needs that get um, completely neglected, and a big framework or theory oriented explanation for this is that a cis and heteronormative value bias clouds judgment of principles. And this is why what is needed are frameworks that, in the theoretical makeup, build on gender and sexual variance as opposed to cis and heteronormativity, which opens up not only the cases, but the frameworks in a completely radical way to deliver the analysis of injustices that are clouded without that basic premise. Bioethics is an excellent platform for reconfigurations of justice because of its specific engagement with justice through principlism, as described before. A highly influential definition of justice is offered by Tove Beauchamp and James Childress, who define justice as a group of norms to fairly distribute benefits, risks, and costs, linking justice to Rawlsian ideas of distributive justice. These are accepted widely, and they consider justice as some kind of fairness. In global comparison, from a moral, societal, and political point of view, it is obvious that fairness is not the current state of affairs, not even as distribution of benefits, risks, and costs, let alone in more detailed ethical analysis. With AMR, for example, its costs are the highest in conditions of extreme scarcity. It can be argued that this constitutes the very opposite of fairness. Moreover, a roles and distributive justice framework does not include multi-species environmental, let alone more than human agency, which is a necessary condition for a framework of justice to achieve fairness in any ethically salient way. The notion that justice would be achieved in decision making, policy making, and ethics making without critical engagement with the limitations of currently dominant moral theories, framing these processes is unfounded. A framework for justice as common morality might be easily accessible, but it leaves out safeguarding against privilege and bias. This often leads to calls for justice, however one conceives of justice, which, when examining the track record of justice from a queer feminist posthuman vantage point, has in fact not been fair at all. In AMR, there are vulnerabilities associated with injustice that follow documented patterns of oppression, but as said, uh, also find novel ways in which it deepens marginalization. Particularly, gendered effects of AMR bioethics are unmapped, even though working with microbes has already shown that, for example, technologies used in management of HIV filter and subsequently reflect and reaffirm, as Ulla McKnight has documented on the level of the body, global issues related to unequal access to advanced biomedical technologies and care, and that reviving and extending work on health inequalities is important to provide evidence on the distribution of need for antibiotics and prevent worsening inequalities through reductions in prescribing mandated by national policies, as Catherine Will has observed. In mapping out these vulnerabilities and especially in seeking to eradicate them, new theoretical approaches are needed not to reiterate moral harms created by cis and heteronormativity. And what I have suggested are queer vulnerabilities as one of its tools. On a conceptual level of antibiotic vulnerabilities and in a queer feminist framework, it is important to consider the following parallel. While vulnerability is both the quality of antibiotics and people in AMR, protection against the latter can in fact become weaponized, as Autumn Fiester has described, against vulnerabilities of the former, as antibiotic-focused care is insufficient. Similarly, cis and heteronormativity in bioethics can threaten basic human rights of LGBTQI+ people and allow exclusion from bioethical principles, as discussed. In a queer feminist framework for vulnerability within AMR, it becomes detectable how cis and heteronormativity in bioethical practices, systems, and policies can infringe the flow of ethical sustainability. At its worst, this infringement becomes intense human suffering, causing the loss of queer lives and establishing the need for LGBTQI+ bioethics, pragmatically, clinically, and morally. Further, this analysis needs to be accompanied with a more than human justice orientation. For firstly, to acknowledge how more than human actors already play an important role in AMR, and secondly, how these roles should be acknowledged in bioethical theory. Moreover, however, crucial for this analysis is not to lose sight of existing power disparities within human species. So to improve bioethical frameworks and drafting action plans for justice, we need to scale both up and down. By using particular concepts like bioethical principles and trying to think about structural logics such as capitalism, racism, we can ground further solidarities, improve theory, and create more inclusive bioethical methodology. Capitalism should in fact be analyzed as an injustice framework. Moving from frameworks of cis and heteronormativity to those of gender and sexual variance, we create spaces for solidarity. To have one of my favorite quotes that inspires all my work from Marielle Lugones, cis and heteronormativity continue to be downplayed despite their, I quote, consistently perverse, violent, and demeaning effects, turning people into animals and turning white women into reproducers of the white race and the middle or upper class. This is obviously a nexus that is very complex and hence is in desperate need of further intersectional analysis. I would like to warmly thank all my funders listed here and offer a very special thank you to a brilliant Black feminist thinker, Dr. Mwenza Plel, who has been influential in shaping my investigation into bioethical theories and framework from an anti-racist point of view. Here are some of my references. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much to the network of Black and Brown in Bioethics for having me as part of this series. Bye.